1248, King Louis IX of France launched a grand crusade to strike at the heart of Islam through Egypt. What began with glory at Damietta ended in disaster at Mansura, forever shaping the fate of Christendom. Before we dive into the incredible story of the Seventh Crusade, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. By the mid-13th century, the crusading movement had already passed through waves of triumph and disillusionment. Since Pope Urban II's call in 1095, Western Christendom had waged successive expeditions to the Holy Land. The First Crusade achieved its dazzling success with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, establishing fragile Latin kingdoms. Yet over the next century, the Crusaders faced constant setbacks. The loss of Edessa in 1144 sparked the failed Second Crusade, while Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187 overshadowed Christian hopes despite Richard the Lionheart's campaigns in the Third Crusade. Later efforts, most notably the Fourth Crusade's diversion to Constantinople in 1204, further fractured Christian unity, while the Fifth Crusade's failure in Egypt, 1217 to 1221, underscored the limits of European arms against Islamic resilience. By 1248, Christendom was at a crossroads. The Holy Land was still contested, and the crusading ideal, though tarnished, retained its powerful hold on the imagination of rulers and the faithful. It was in this atmosphere that Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, took a solemn vow. Gravely ill in 1244, the young king swore that if God granted him recovery, he would lead a crusade to defend Christendom and liberate the Holy Land. His motivations were deeply rooted in a blend of personal piety, dynastic prestige, and a sense of divine kingship. For Louis, crusading was not merely a military enterprise, but a sacred duty, embodying his vision of himself as the most Christian king. The 13th century's religious, political, and military landscape shaped his resolve. Papal authority was still a commanding force, yet divided Christendom faced internal strife, shifting alliances, and the growing power of Islamic dynasties, particularly in Egypt. Against this backdrop, Louis's expedition, the Seventh Crusade, emerged as both a continuation of crusading tradition and a bold attempt to reclaim Christian fortunes in the East. Background to the Seventh Crusade. The Seventh Crusade cannot be understood without examining the troubled legacy of earlier expeditions. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, had aimed to weaken Muslim power by striking at Egypt, the strategic heart of the Ayyubid dynasty. Initially promising, it ended in disaster when the Crusaders were trapped by the Nile's floods and forced to surrender at Damietta. This failure revealed both the logistical challenges of campaigning in Egypt and the difficulties of maintaining unity among European leaders and papal legates. The Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, led by Emperor Frederick II, unfolded very differently. Through negotiation rather than battle, Frederick secured a treaty with the Ayyubids that temporarily restored Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control, yet his methods were controversial. The Pope had excommunicated him, and many saw his diplomacy as undermining papal authority. Moreover, the territorial gains proved short-lived, as Jerusalem fell again to Muslim forces in 1244. The sense of humiliation weighed heavily on Christendom, fueling calls for renewed action. Meanwhile, the Muslim world was undergoing its own transformations. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin, still controlled Egypt and Syria, but it was plagued by internal rivalries. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, though diminished politically, remained a spiritual authority for Islam. Most significantly, a new military class, the Mamluks. Slave soldiers who rose through merit was gaining influence in Egypt. Their discipline and ambition would soon shape the fate of the Crusades as they prepared to challenge both the Ayyubids and the Crusaders. In Europe, the papacy remained the primary advocate of crusading, promoting it as both a spiritual duty and a unifying cause. Yet enthusiasm among monarchs was uneven. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and smaller principalities were distracted by local conflicts. France, under the deeply devout Louis IX, thus emerged as the central power willing to shoulder the burden of a new crusade, setting the stage for the campaign of 1248. Louis IX, the Crusader king, Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, was one of the most remarkable monarchs of medieval Europe. Born in 1214, he ascended the throne in 1226 after the death of his father, Louis VIII. As a young king, he was guided by his mother, Blanche of Castile, whose strict moral upbringing instilled in him an unshakable devotion to the Catholic faith. Unlike many medieval rulers known for ambition or ruthlessness, Louis combined regal authority with deep personal piety. His reputation for fairness, justice, and humility earned him the admiration of his subjects and the respect of churchmen across Europe. By the 1230s, France had achieved a period of relative stability. Louis strengthened royal power, curbed rebellious nobles, and fostered an image of France as the eldest daughter of the Church. This political foundation allowed him to consider ventures beyond his kingdom's borders. His role as a Christian monarch was central to his identity. He viewed kingship not merely as a political duty, but as a sacred trust bestowed by God. Louis's decision to take the cross was deeply personal. In 1234, he fell gravely ill and seemed near death. During this crisis, he vowed that if he recovered, he would dedicate himself to leading a crusade. His recovery, seen as miraculous, reinforced his conviction that God had chosen him for this mission. Over the next few years, between 1234 and 1238, Louis transformed this vow into a fixed goal, embracing the crusade as both a spiritual obligation and a means to defend Christendom. Preparations for the expedition were meticulous. Louis secured papal approval, raised funds through taxation and donations, and organized supplies and ships. He emphasized discipline and religious devotion among his troops, presenting the campaign not only as a war, but as a holy pilgrimage. For Louis, the Seventh Crusade was the fulfillment of both his vow and his vision of kingship. Preparations for the campaign. The preparations for the Seventh Crusade were among the most ambitious undertakings of the 13th century, reflecting Louis IX's determination to lead not just a military expedition, but a spiritual mission. Financing such a vast enterprise was the first challenge. Louis introduced a special crusading tax known as the decime, which was levied on clerical revenues with papal approval. He also contributed large sums from his personal treasury, selling royal lands and jewels to ensure that the campaign would not falter for lack of resources. Wealthy nobles and towns across France were encouraged to donate, presenting the crusade as a collective Christian duty. To transport the army, Louis commissioned the construction of a powerful fleet at Aigues-Mortes, a new Mediterranean port he had developed precisely for this purpose. Unlike most French harbors, Aigues-Mortes lay directly under royal control, enabling Louis to oversee every detail. Shipwrights, carpenters, and merchants worked tirelessly to build and provision galleys, transports, and supply ships capable of carrying thousands of men, horses, and stores across the sea. The port itself was fortified and expanded, a symbol of France's commitment to the crusading cause. Recruitment was another critical element. Louis called upon the great nobles of France, many of whom pledged their service out of loyalty and piety. Knights, foot soldiers, and volunteers flocked to the royal banner, inspired by the king's example. Entire families prepared for the journey, while preachers spread the crusading message across the kingdom, portraying enlistment as both honorable and salvific. Departure and journey to Cyprus, 1248. In the summer of 1248, after years of preparation, King Louis IX set forth on his long-anticipated crusade. The fleet gathered at Aegis Mortis, where thousands of soldiers, nobles, and pilgrims assembled in a scene of both solemn devotion and martial spectacle. Before departure, Louis personally attended religious ceremonies, reinforcing the spiritual nature of the expedition. The embarkation was carefully coordinated to ensure that troops, horses, weapons, and provisions could survive the arduous sea journey across the Mediterranean. The voyage itself was no small feat. Medieval fleets were vulnerable to storms, disease, and shortages, yet Louis's meticulous planning minimized risks. The fleet maintained close formation, and supply ships carried grain, wine, salted meat, and fresh water to sustain the Crusaders. The crossing was relatively smooth, a testament to both favorable conditions and sound organization. For many Crusaders, the voyage symbolized a sacred passage, a leaving behind of worldly concerns for the service of God. Their first major destination was the island of Cyprus, long a key staging ground for Crusader operations in the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus offered safe harbors, abundant provisions, and a strategic location near both the Levant and Egypt. Here, Louis established his base of operations, allowing time to regroup, strengthen logistics, and refine his military plans. The island became a vast encampment where armies trained, supplies were stockpiled, and councils of war were held. From Cyprus, Louis and his advisors devised their strategy to strike directly at Egypt, the power center of the Ayyubid dynasty. Past crusading experience had shown that control of Egypt could destabilize Muslim rule across the region and potentially open the road to Jerusalem. Thus, Cyprus was not merely a temporary stop, but the springboard for the bold and risky assault that would define the Seventh Crusade. The Egyptian campaign begins, 1249. In June 1249, Louis IX launched his campaign with a bold strike at the Egyptian port city of Damietta, a target previously contested during the Fifth Crusade. The crusading fleet, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, knights, and clerics, landed near the mouth of the Nile. Despite fears of a difficult landing, the operation unfolded with surprising success. The Ayyubid garrison, unprepared for the sudden assault, quickly abandoned the city. By early June, Damietta fell almost without resistance, providing the Crusaders with a fortified base and access to the Nile's vital waterways. The capture of Damietta filled the Crusaders with confidence. Louis interpreted the swift victory as a divine sign, reinforcing his belief that God favored their mission. Supplies, wealth, and strategic position were now in Christian hands, and many envisioned a rapid march toward Cairo, the heart of Egypt. Yet this very success bred overconfidence and delay. Instead of advancing immediately, the Crusaders lingered in Damietta through the summer heat. Logistics, disagreements among commanders, and Louis's desire to wait for reinforcements slowed momentum. This pause gave the Egyptians time to regroup, rallying under their commanders and preparing for a counter-offensive. The delay would prove costly as the campaign pressed deeper into Egypt. March toward Cairo, 1249 to 1250. After securing Damietta, Louis IX resolved to march south toward Cairo, the seat of Ayyubid power. Yet the journey through the Nile Delta proved grueling. The Crusaders faced sweltering heat, marshy terrain, and an unforgiving landscape of canals and floodplains. Supplies were difficult to transport, disease spread among the soldiers, and horses weakened in the damp conditions. Despite the hardships, Louis pressed onward. Determined to deliver a decisive blow, the march culminated in the Battle of Mansura in early 1250, one of the most dramatic clashes of the Seventh Crusade. Louis's brother, Robert of Artois, led an impetuous cavalry charge across a pontoon bridge into the city. Initially, the attack achieved stunning success, scattering the Egyptian defenders. But Robert, ignoring orders to consolidate, advanced recklessly into the narrow streets of Mansura. There, his knights were trapped, surrounded, and cut down in brutal close-quarters fight. Mo brother himself was killed, a devastating blow to both morale and command structure. The Egyptians, now strengthened by the rising power of the Mamluks, turned the tide of battle. These highly trained slave soldiers, loyal and disciplined, proved far more formidable than the Crusaders had anticipated. At Mansura, they displayed tactical brilliance, containing the Crusader advance and inflicting heavy casualties. Their effectiveness foreshadowed the decisive role they would soon play in Egypt's future. For Louis, the battle was both a test of leadership and a warning. The loss of his brother, the exhaustion of his troops, and the growing strength of the Egyptian resistance revealed the immense challenges of his campaign. Yet, still convinced of his divine mission, he refused to retreat, committing his forces to a struggle that would soon reach a tragic climax. Disaster at Mansura, 1250. The events following the Battle of Mansura spiraled into catastrophe for the Crusaders. After Robert of Artois' reckless charge and death, Louis IX tried to stabilize his forces, but the army was already overextended and disorganized in hostile territory. The Crusaders struggled with poor coordination, inadequate supplies, and the unforgiving Nile Delta, which turned maneuvering into a logistical nightmare. At this critical juncture, the Egyptians were led by the brilliant and ambitious Baibars, or rising commander among the Mamluks. Baibars orchestrated a series of counterattacks that exploited the Crusaders' weaknesses. Using hit-and-run cavalry, surprise ambushes, and knowledge of the terrain, he steadily wore down the French. His forces blocked supply routes, harassed encampments, and trapped Louis' army within makeshift fortifications, cutting them off from reinforcements and provisions. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion ravaged the Crusaders as they became increasingly immobilized. What had begun as a confident march toward Cairo had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Surrounded and weakened, Louis's once mighty army found itself hemmed in by Baibars' relentless tactics and the superior discipline of the Mamluks. The disaster at Mansura marked the unraveling of the Seventh Crusade, leading directly to the king's capture, the capture of Louis IX, 1250. By early 1250, the Crusader army was in dire straits. Hemmed in around Mansura, Louis IX and his men faced dwindling supplies and the constant threat of ambush. The unforgiving conditions of the Nile Delta compounded their misery. Disease, particularly dysentery and scurvy, spread rapidly through the ranks, striking down both common soldiers and noble leaders. Weakened and starving, the Crusaders could no longer sustain offensive operations, and the hope of marching on Cairo evaporated. In April, Louis attempted a retreat down the Nile, hoping to withdraw toward Damietta, yet nature itself turned against him. The annual Nile floods swelled the rivers and canals, cutting off escape routes and making movement nearly impossible for the army and its baggage. Weighed down by sick men, starving horses, and dwindling supplies, the Crusaders found themselves trapped. In the chaos, Egyptian forces under the command of the Mamluks pressed their advantage, relentlessly harassing the retreating army. At the village of Faraskar, the French were surrounded. Exhausted, diseased, and hopelessly outnumbered, Louis's army crumbled. Thousands were killed or captured, and the king himself, too ill to stand, was taken prisoner by the Mamluks. His royal dignity did not save him from humiliation, as he was paraded in captivity. The fate of the crusade now rested on negotiations with the Egyptians. Louis agreed to surrender Damietta, which the Crusaders had captured so easily the year before, and to pay a massive ransom of 400,000 livres tournoi, an astronomical sum. Only after this agreement was honored did Louis and the surviving nobles secure their release. The surrender marked not only the collapse of the Seventh Crusade, but also the beginning of Mamluk ascendancy in the region. Imprisonment and ransom. The capture of Louis IX in April 1250 sent shockwaves through Christendom. For the first time in crusading history, a reigning European monarch had fallen into Muslim hands. Louis, weakened by illness and the hardships of the campaign, was treated with a mixture of respect and humiliation by his captors, the Mamluks, who had now become the dominant force in Egypt after overthrowing the Ayyubid leadership. Unlike many prisoners, Louis was not executed or mistreated, but his royal dignity could not disguise the catastrophic failure of his crusade. The question of ransom quickly became the central issue. The Egyptians demanded an immense payment of 400,000 livres tournois, a sum so vast that it strained the finances of France and the Crusader states. The king himself negotiated through intermediaries, demonstrating calmness and resolve even in captivity. Louis agreed to the terms, knowing that without ransom, his army and the remaining Christian prisoners would face destruction. In addition to the money, the Egyptians insisted on the return of Damietta, the crucial port city captured by the Crusaders in 1249. Reluctantly, Louis complied, and Damietta was handed back to Muslim control, erasing the only major gain of the entire expedition. The exchange underscored the futility of the campaign. What had been won with ease was lost in desperation. After the ransom was paid and Damietta surrendered, Louis and the surviving nobles were freed. Yet, instead of returning immediately to France, the king chose to remain in the Levant for several years, reorganizing the Crusader states and attempting to salvage something from the debacle. His imprisonment and ransom, however, became the defining symbol of the Seventh Crusade's failure, a sobering reminder of the limits of even the most devout king's power in the face of determined adversaries. Louis IX in the Holy Land, 1250 to 1254. Although freed in 1250 after paying his ransom, Louis IX did not immediately return to France. Many of his advisors urged him to go home, restore stability, and rebuild his kingdom after the crushing defeat in Egypt. Yet Louis, bound by his vow and driven by his deep sense of piety, refused to abandon the Holy Land while it remained in peril. For nearly 4 years, he based himself in the coastal cities of Acre, Jaffa, and Caesarea, working tirelessly to strengthen the fragile Latin presence in the east. Louis oversaw extensive fortification projects, repairing and expanding city walls, castles, and harbors to withstand Muslim assaults. He personally invested royal funds in these defenses, ensuring that even if the Crusader states lacked manpower, they would not lack strongholds. His presence also reassured the demoralized local Christians, who saw in him a symbol of steadfast faith despite the recent disasters. Diplomacy was another key focus of his efforts. Louis sought to secure allies by opening channels with the Mongols, whose expansion across Asia seemed to threaten both Muslim powers and Christian kingdoms alike. Though these negotiations bore little fruit, they reflected his determination to explore every possibility. At the same time, he attempted truces and dialogues with local Muslim leaders, hoping to buy time for the Crusader states. Within Christendom, he mediated disputes among rival barons and orders, trying to unify a divided front. By 1254, however, the strain of his long absence could no longer be ignored. With news of his mother Blanche of Castile's death and political pressures mounting in France, Louis finally resolved to return. His years in the Holy Land, though yielding no great victories, preserved the Crusader states from immediate collapse and reinforced his reputation as a devout protector of Christendom. Failure and return to France, 1254. By 1254, after nearly 6 years abroad, King Louis IX resolved to return to France. The Seventh Crusade had ended in undeniable failure. The central objective, breaking Muslim power in Egypt and reclaiming Jerusalem, remained unfulfilled. Instead, the Crusaders suffered a devastating defeat at Mansura, the humiliating capture of their king, and the forced surrender of Damietta. Strategic missteps, logistical difficulties in the Nile Delta, and the rise of the Mamluks all contributed to the collapse of the expedition. Unlike the First Crusade's triumphs, Louis's effort highlighted the diminishing returns of crusading in the 13th century. The costs were immense. Financially, the 400,000 livres ransom drained the French treasury, while additional expenses of fleet building, fortifications, and provisioning left the kingdom burdened. Human losses were even greater. Thousands of knights, soldiers, and pilgrims perished from battle, disease, or captivity. Families in France mourned, and the military strength of the realm was temporarily weakened. For many, the campaign seemed a futile sacrifice with little to show in return. Yet Louis's reputation at home did not suffer as one might expect. His personal bravery, piety, and endurance in captivity inspired respect. Rather than being condemned, he was admired for fulfilling his vow and for his devotion to God in the face of adversity. Chroniclers praised his justice, humility, and unwavering faith, qualities that elevated him beyond the battlefield defeat. Upon his return, Louis turned to governing France with renewed energy, initiating reforms in law, administration, and the strengthening of royal authority. Thus, while the Seventh Crusade was a failure in military and strategic terms, it enhanced Louis IX's personal aura of holiness. This paradox, failure abroad, yet veneration at home, shaped his legacy as both a tragic crusader and a saintly king. Period. The Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1254, left a profound mark on both France and Christendom. For France, the campaign was a costly venture that drained the royal treasury and claimed thousands of lives. Yet politically, Louis IX's return restored stability, and his governance reforms, strengthening royal justice, curbing corruption, and centralizing authority, outweighed the material losses of the failed expedition. In Christendom more broadly, the Crusade reinforced doubts about the effectiveness of large-scale expeditions to the east. The dream of reclaiming Jerusalem by force seemed increasingly unrealistic, eroded by repeated failures and shifting geopolitical realities. One of the most significant outcomes was the rise of the Mamluks in Egypt. The debacle at Mansura and Louis's capture accelerated their consolidation of power. Soon after, the Mamluks overthrew the Ayyubids, establishing a dynasty that would dominate Egypt and Syria for centuries. They emerged as the Crusaders' most formidable opponents, defeating later Crusades and ultimately expelling Christian forces from the Holy Land. Thus, the Seventh Crusade indirectly paved the way for a stronger, more unified Muslim power in the region. For later Crusaders, the expedition offered sobering lessons. It demonstrated the dangers of overconfidence, the logistical impossibility of campaigning in the Nile Delta, and the futility of attempting to subdue Egypt without overwhelming resources. Subsequent crusading efforts, such as the Eighth Crusade, also led by Louis IX, were shaped by these hard-learned realities, though they too ended in disappointment. Despite failure, Louis IX's personal sanctity redefined the memory of the Crusade. His piety, endurance in captivity, and unwavering devotion to God inspired admiration across Europe. In 1297, the Church canonized him as Saint Louis, elevating his image from a defeated Crusader king to a model of Christian kingship. His legacy was thus not military triumph, but moral and spiritual authority, an enduring symbol of the crusading ideal transformed into saintly virtue. Conclusion: the Seventh Crusade stands as one of the most dramatic episodes of the later crusading era. Though it ended in failure, its significance lies in what it revealed about the realities of faith, leadership, and military ambition in the 13th century. At its heart was Louis IX, whose devotion and personal courage inspired loyalty but could not overcome the logistical challenges of Egypt's terrain or the growing strength of the Mamluks. His capture symbolized the vulnerability of even the most powerful Christian monarch when confronted with determined opponents and harsh realities. The crusade also underscores the tension between faith and pragmatism. Louis's commitment to his vow embodied the highest ideals of Christian kingship, yet his unyielding sense of duty blinded him to practical limits. The military campaign collapsed under poor strategy, disease, and overconfidence. But the king's personal sanctity elevated him in the eyes of his contemporaries and later generation. Ultimately, the Seventh Crusade was a military disaster, but a spiritual triumph in shaping Louis' reputation. It highlighted the declining effectiveness of the crusading movement, while cementing the king's image as a saintly ruler whose legacy endured beyond the battlefield. Faith, leadership, and failure intertwined to define its enduring place in history.